In the quiet corners of existence, where shadows dance and time slips through our fingers, there lies a truth that few dare to confront. It is a truth wrapped in the fabric of our fears, a specter that haunts the edges of our consciousness. This is the tale of a wanderer, a timekeeper, and the relentless pursuit of understanding the inevitable, death. There is a strange comfort in ignorance, a blissful oblivion where death is merely a distant silhouette on the horizon. Most people live their lives shielded by this fragile veil, never noticing the ticking clock that shadows their every step. But some are not so fortunate. I wasn't always like this. There was a time when I had a name, a home, and a past filled with laughter and muscat-scented winds. That time is gone now, fragmented into vague memories that no longer belong to me. I've become something else, a wanderer, a timekeeper. Though I didn't choose this path, it has defined me. This is the story of how I came to know who I truly am, and of the man who dared to confront me. I miss the burning winds of Andalora. They sweep over the land, carrying the weight of the sun on their shoulders, pressing against your face and scattering grains of dry sand through your hair. There's a particular sweetness in the valley breeze, ripened by clusters of golden grapes shimmering in the midday light. From where I stand now, I see the little house where my story began. White chapels dot the horizon, scattered like chess pieces in a game yet to unfold. The cracked asphalt of El Caminito snakes through the landscape, bending and disappearing beyond the horizon. Rusty trucks creak along, headlights flickering in erratic patterns as they navigate the winding roads. One of those roadside stops marks the beginning of a trail, barely visible among tangled grass and sand. Most travelers wouldn't give it a second glance, and why would they? It leads to nowhere, or so they'd think. But I know better. This path brought me here, to this hilltop where my tale is destined to end. Years of wandering, exile, and fear are about to come to a final halt. Below me, the valley stretches out in all its serene beauty, while I stand poised on the edge, savoring what could be my last breath. Soon, he will arrive. He always does. His silhouette looms at the bend of El Caminito, a relentless figure leaning heavily on his cane. He pauses, catching his breath, as though summoning the last shred of strength for this final pursuit. Despite the toll time has taken on his body, he presses forward. And I wait. Today, I won't run. I won't flee from him. No more hiding. This sharpened knife in my trembling hand will be the key to ending it all. I'll drive it into his neck, severing bone and sinew. The man I've only ever known as the Stalker will haunt me no more. It was the early days of October in Lundora, a city alive with the hum of autumn. As usual, I started my morning with a modest breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, and dark roast coffee at Barrowmore's Diner. The air was crisp as I strolled toward the office, savoring the tranquility of the quiet streets. My route was always the same: pass through the main square, turn right onto Gregor Street, left at Latham Avenue, then another right at Mayfield. But that day, my mind was tangled in thoughts about the article I was writing. I barely noticed the figure sitting by the wrought iron gate of the square at first. Lundora was no stranger to eccentric souls, musicians strumming on street corners, and the occasional barefoot poet. But this man was different. There was something about him that made my stomach twist. His tattered striped coat hung off his shoulders like a flag of defeat, and the heavy cap on his head cast shadows over piercing eyes that seemed etched in stone. There was a coldness in his expression, a silent fury that gripped me unexpectedly. A strange unease washed over me, urging me to walk faster, to put distance between us. But when I glanced back, he had risen from his spot, moving toward me with eerie purpose. Just a wanderer, I told myself. But my instincts screamed otherwise. My pulse quickened as I turned onto Gregor Street, only to find it eerily deserted. I could hear my footsteps echoing, or was it the pounding of my heart? The dread clawing at my chest was unlike anything I'd felt before. It wasn't just fear, it was primal, ancient, as though a shadow loomed over me, scythe in hand. I ran, not in a full sprint, but enough to signal urgency without appearing terrified. The man followed, his pace relentless. I couldn't shake the image of those cold, drilling eyes. By the time I reached Latham Avenue, I was gasping for breath, beads of sweat stinging my eyes. I paused to glance back, expecting to see him inches behind me. But the street was empty. Shame crawled up my spine. "Pull yourself together, Ferran," I muttered under my breath. "You're imagining things." I forced a laugh, trying to mask my trembling hands. By the time I reached the office, the familiar smell of ink and paper settled my nerves. It was my sanctuary. Still, a gnawing doubt lingered. Was it just paranoia, or had my descent into madness begun that day? Madness creeps like the tide, doesn't it? Lapping at the edges until it overwhelms everything. An hour later, I found myself laughing at the absurdity of my fear. But the day wasn't done with its surprises. My editor stormed into the room, a stack of papers in hand. "No time for any nonsense, Ferran. You're covering Borges's book presentation at the Lundora Public Hall today. Get moving." I froze. Borges. After all these years, the thrill of seeing the literary legend again washed over me, pushing aside the morning's terror. I hailed a cab and raced toward the hall, my mind already buzzing with questions. The streets blurred past, my thoughts consumed by memories of Cordova and that fateful encounter with the master writer himself. 9 years ago, he'd predicted we'd meet again. I didn't believe him then. But here I was. I hurried up the marble steps of the Grand Hall, shoving through a crowd of reporters to secure a front row seat. Borges appeared, his presence commanding despite his blindness. As the crowd hushed, I felt a familiar chill crawl up my spine. "Yes, Senor Ferran," Borges said suddenly, as though reading my thoughts. "We meet again, just as I told you we would." After the lecture, Borges spoke directly to me, his voice calm yet authoritative. "You enjoy Colombian coffee, don't you, Mr. Ferran?" he asked with unsettling certainty. "I shall see you at 6 o'clock. My assistant will provide you with the address." His unseeing eyes remained fixed on a distant corner of the hall, oblivious to the audience now buzzing with curiosity. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment I became the center of attention. I could already imagine the questions awaiting me the next day. Why does Borges know you? Were you raised in Cordova? Are you his illegitimate son? At that moment, I had no answers, and the truth would only unravel years later. As I stood there, the past and present blurred into a haze of fragmented memories. I tried to summon images of my childhood home, the Muscat orchards, and the white chapels dotting the valley, but they were elusive, slipping through my grasp like sand. I opened my eyes, gazing down the winding trail. He was still coming, stubbornly climbing the hill, pausing only to catch his breath. His determination was carved into every strained movement, his grip on the wobbling cane as tight as ever. "Come and take me, old man," I muttered. "If you can." His expression remained resolute, a faint grin tugging at his weathered face as if whispering, "We shall see." Later that evening, I found myself in Borges's hotel room, an organized chaos of books and papers. A portable book rack caught my attention, filled with volumes I'd never heard of. Before I could examine them, the door creaked open, and Borges entered, his cane swaying leisurely. "Ah, Senor Ferran, how kind of you to visit this old man," he said warmly. I stammered some incoherent response, overwhelmed by the surreal situation. He gestured to a chair. "I trust you will enjoy this Colombian dark roast," he added, settling into his seat. As we sipped the aromatic brew, Borges spoke with his characteristic candor. "Do you know the greatest advantage of being blind?" he asked. "We don't need light. My utility bills are much lower." He chuckled at his own joke, but the humor was short-lived. His expression grew somber. "I know you have many questions, Senor Ferran," he continued. "I will answer some, but not all. The rest you must uncover yourself." My mind raced with bewilderment. How did this literary genius know my name, my past? "Have you read the Book of Imaginary Beings?" he asked suddenly. "Yes, many times," I replied. "I first read it in Spanish when it was published, and recently I bought an English copy at a dusty shop near Oxford Circus." He nodded thoughtfully. "That book is a labyrinth, ever-changing and alive. Human imagination knows no bounds, and neither does that work." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "But there's something no one knows. I intended to include one more being in that book, one called Quietus Est." A chill ran down my spine. "Quietus Est?" I echoed. It appeared across cultures, centuries apart. At first, I thought it was merely a myth, but the more I researched, the more agitated I became. My fascination turned into something else entirely: fear. "Fear of what, Senor Borges?" His gaze seemed to pierce through the room, as if he could see me clearly despite his blindness. "Fear of the truth," he whispered. "Quietus Est is not a myth at all." His hand trembled as he attempted to lift his cup, spilling coffee onto the saucer. Borges took a deep breath, struggling to steady his trembling hands. "Pardon me, young man. I'm trying to maintain composure, but you haven't even tasted the coffee," he said, wiping his mouth and forehead with a knitted handkerchief. I obediently raised the small cup and took a sip, the rich fumes of Colombian beans filling my senses. "Pardon me, Senor Borges," I began hesitantly, "but are you saying that quietus est, this being you mentioned, was not imaginary? Is that why you left it out of the Book of Imaginary Beings?" "Only partly," he admitted, his voice grave. "Fear was the reason. Imagine the world knowing that death isn't just a vague concept, not merely a grim folklore figure, but a living entity. Imagine if every person could see death walking beside them, showing them the seconds ticking away. A perpetual reminder of their inevitable end." He leaned back, his frail body sagging as though burdened by the weight of his revelations. "Running from death, Mr. Farron, is worse than death itself." With a sigh, he gestured toward a drawer. "In there, you will find my scribbles from years ago. They are unedited. Please pardon the rough language. Read it aloud while I attempt to catch my breath." I retrieved a yellowed sheet filled with cursive writing in Spanish, interspersed with Latin phrases. The paper bore numerous corrections and scratches, as if written by a man grappling with both blindness and an overwhelming need to document something incomprehensible. I unfolded it carefully and began reading. "Quietus est. It is said that no mortal knows the precise time of their demise. Even the terminally ill are spared such knowledge. The Sumerians believed in a certain entity, not a deity, but a harbinger of death embodied in human form. This being would follow its chosen victims, counting down their remaining time. Some clay tablets buried with the dead referenced this entity. The luminous ones, those cursed or spiritually heightened, could see it. Egyptian texts later replaced it with the more familiar figures of Anubis and Horus, but remnants of its description persisted: a wanderer, eternal and tireless. The entity was later given a name, Quietus est. Legends depict it as a seemingly ordinary person standing by a sun clock, measuring the time the chosen had left. If the chosen one couldn't escape, the wanderer would advance the clock hands, stealing precious moments until the inevitable. "Enough, Mr. Farron," Borges interrupted with a trembling voice. "You understand now." His expression darkened as he leaned forward, the dim light casting a sharp shadow over his lined face. "Quietus est is an eternal wanderer, always with us. A timekeeper at the edge of the stage, ticking down the seconds we have left. The greatest gift given to mankind is its inability to see him." He paused, his voice faltering. "When I lost my sight, I thought blindness was a blessing. But I was wrong. One does not need eyes to perceive the wanderer. What eyes cannot see, ears can hear, and skin can feel." He fixed me with an unnerving gaze. "You saw him, didn't you, Mr. Farron?" Cold shivers raced up my spine, and a lump of nausea lodged in my throat. My breath came in ragged gasps. "I saw him today," I admitted hoarsely. Borges nodded solemnly. "Ordinary humans have the luxury of ignorance. They can whistle through life, blissfully unaware of the ticking clock. But those who see quietus est, the luminous ones, are cursed. Knowledge is madness, Mr. Farron. Knowledge of death is worse than death itself." We sat in his hotel room until dawn, two luminous and doomed souls, our conversation punctuated by the relentless ticking of the clock. Borges dozed off, his left hand resting on his cane, eyelids fluttering as though caught in a dream. I left Borges' hotel that night, stepping into the desolate streets of Londora. The dim light from the street lamps cast jagged shadows on the pavement, and the wind swept autumn leaves in frantic circles. The night was cold and eerily quiet. I hid behind a stone column, scanning the street for him. He wasn't there, but I felt his presence, lingering like a faint whisper at the edge of perception. The orchards from my childhood flickered in my mind, faint echoes of memories that refused to materialize fully. It was as if he had taken my past from me, leaving only hollow fragments. "Wait, mortal. 5 more minutes and you'll know the answer," his voice echoed in my thoughts. Borges had warned me, never look him in the eyes. Never come close. If he approaches, run, but he will always follow. And so I ran, but running was futile. He was always there, relentless as a shadow. 2 nights later, I moved into a dilapidated hotel near my office, hoping the change of location would throw him off. Room B6 was in the basement, down a dimly lit corridor. As I fumbled with the key, the air grew heavy with an oppressive stillness. I should have turned back, But I didn't. I pushed the door open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. Pale yellow light filtered through a narrow street-level window, casting eerie streaks on the worn carpet. The room smelled of dust and neglect. And there he was, sitting on the edge of the bed, a rope coiled loosely in his hand, a thin, white sheet draped over his head like a funeral shroud. Time froze. My breath caught in my throat and sweat poured from my skin. My hand fumbled behind me, desperately trying to twist the doorknob. He stood with a groan, taking a deliberate step toward me. My slippery fingers failed to grip the handle. "Open it," my mind screamed. The corridor outside flickered like scenes from a silent horror film. B5, B3, stairs, exit. "Your time is coming, Ferran." The whisper crawled into my ears, cold and venomous. I ran until my legs buckled beneath me, collapsing in an alley littered with trash. The dawn light found me there, trembling and drenched in sweat. Madness took hold in the days that followed. I abandoned my flat, drifting from one city to the next, taking temporary jobs and sleeping on the streets. No matter how far I traveled, he was always there. Sometimes I'd spot him on the opposite side of the street or in the next subway car. I wrote desperate letters to Borges, begging for answers. He never replied. I scoured his books, searching for hidden messages, analyzing every word. It was a futile obsession until 1983, when I stumbled upon his final work, The Memory of Shakespeare. The story's protagonist inherits Shakespeare's memories, which gradually replace his own. Names, faces, and events from centuries past overshadow his present reality. The story spoke directly to me. Borges's hidden message was clear. To end the torment, I had to confront him. And so I returned to where it all began. Now I crouch behind a rock on this desolate hill, waiting. His breath is labored, his body bent under its own weight. One last push, and he'll reach me. I grip the knife tightly, its blade gleaming in the fading light. "Time's up, quietus est," I whisper. He doesn't resist. My blade finds its mark beneath his Adam's apple. A series of wet, popping sounds escape his throat. "What are you trying to tell me, old man?" I ask, easing the pressure. "Let me hear your last words." A chilling sound fills the air, not words, but laughter. "You're mistaken," he coughs, his lips darkened with crimson. "You've misunderstood everything. Let me help you see the truth." I ease the pressure, allowing him to sit up. His breath is labored, each exhale rattling like a broken instrument. "All my life, I followed you," he says slowly. "It's a wonder I made it this far. Ever since I left Cordova, I was living on borrowed time, labeled unstable, doctor after doctor, countless treatments, meditative practices. I tried them all. Some offered relief, but the shadows always returned, stronger than before. They clung to my mind, pushing me toward the abyss." His voice falters. "It all started in Londora. That morning, sitting alone on a bench in the square, the weight crushing me." He exhales, his eyes distant. "I nearly gave in at that hotel, B6. I sat for hours, gripped by uncertainty, the silence of the room pressing down on me. Darkness loomed in the corners, watching, waiting. How I longed for the struggle to end. But fate had other plans. Not then, not there. My journey wasn't over." He pauses, rubbing his neck. "Since that day, it's been a game of pursuit. I sought an end, yet it always slipped away, until now." He gestures toward the valley below. "I was born in that house. I remember it all. My parents, my childhood treasures, school, the muscat orchards, and Sunday gatherings at the Whitechapel. I remember rugs being washed in the streets and the air rich with the scent of grapes." His voice drops to a whisper. "My name is Ferran Augusto Navarre." He meets my gaze, his eyes blazing with certainty. "And you? You have no name, yet they call you quietus est, the one who roams." A fire ignites within me, spreading through every fiber of my being. "Lies!" I roar. "You speak nothing but lies." "Look at me," he insists. "I am aged, and you remain unchanged, untouched by time, as you always will be. You haven't aged a day." My mind reels. Fragments of memories flicker, distant echoes, fleeting sensations. "You don't own those memories," he continues. "Master Borges uncovered the truth. He saw through it all and deceived you. He led you to believe you were me. That was his escape, never revealing the truth until the very end." His voice shakes. "You are the one who roams, and the past you hold on to, it belongs to me." Rage courses through me as I cast the blade aside. I won't need it to end this. My hands close around his frail neck, feeling the resistance weaken. His final breath drifts into the air, carried down to the valley, past the Whitechapel and the home of his childhood. The scorching wind of Andalora brushes across his still face, weaving through his hair. I stand, my hands aching from the act. The watch on my wrist ticks steadily as I turn it back. Step by step, I descend the hill, reaching El Caminito Road. A bus approaches from the distance. I will board it and head west, or perhaps north. The direction is meaningless. I am the one who roams. The bus rumbles along the dusty road, its windows streaked with the remnants of yesterday's storm. I sit near the back, silence pressing against my chest. My hands rest on my knees, fingers still tingling from the final act upon that desolate hill. The old man's last words linger, carried by the wind to the valley where his past now sleeps. He claimed I had no name, that I was nothing but a shadow drifting through time. Perhaps he was right. I press my forehead against the cool glass, watching the world blur past. The destination doesn't matter. It never does. Roads twist and turn, but to me they are all the same. I exist between moments, in the flicker of a second hand, in the shadows cast by the fading light. I will always wander. As the bus rolls on, an unfamiliar sensation washes over me. A flicker of recognition, a whisper of a memory that is not my own. The faces of strangers beyond the window shift, morphing into reflections of a life I never lived. I close my eyes, willing the feeling away, but it clings to me like mist before dawn. Suddenly, the bus lurches to a stop. I glance up to see a figure at the door, a man draped in a tattered striped coat, eyes sharp with knowing. My heartbeat quickens as understanding dawns. It's him, the man I was sure had faded into the past. "Time's up, quietus est," he says, a slow smile forming. "You've been running long enough." And in that instant, I understand. I am not the pursuer. I am the pursued. The cycle continues, and I am bound to the path, forever entangled in this chase track, forever lost in the shadows of my own existence.